Amen. Good morning.
Good morning.
It's great to be with you here today. We are worshiping the Lord, but we are also in week 2 of our series that we started. It's called I Am. If you were with us last week, what we said is in this series, what we're doing is we're looking at 7 I Am statements that Jesus gives in which he describes himself. In any relationship that we have, one of the greatest goals, of course, is to understand the other person. And the same with our relationship with God. We want to have an understanding of who he is. We want to know what Jesus is like. And one of the best ways is simply to listen to what he says. The book of John actually records these 7 I Am statements, which Jesus is telling us something about himself. And it's a great way to get to know what he's like. Now, last week we started off with a bang and looked at John chapter 8, where Jesus actually uses the Old Testament name for God, Yahweh, and applies it to himself. They were pressing him, saying, Jesus, tell us who you are. And Jesus responds by using the Old Testament name for God and applies it to himself. And they get a little bit upset with him. And in John chapter 20, I meant to share this with you last week. John actually does us a favor, and he tells us why he records the stories he records. He says in John chapter 20, verse 30, says, the disciples saw Jesus do many other miraculous signs in addition to the ones recorded in this book, but these are written that so you may continue to believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing in him, you will have life by the power of his name. He's saying that there was other stories that he could have recorded, but the book would be so huge. But what he's saying is he recorded these so that we would believe that Jesus is the Messiah and that Jesus is the Son of the living God. And so that's why when we're reading through John, we can know what he is trying to communicate to us. The I Am statement we're looking at today is in John chapter 11, verse 26. Jesus told her, I am the resurrection and the life. Anyone who believes in me will live even after dying. He says, I am the resurrection and the life. And it's actually interesting. When Jesus shows up on the scene, there's actually a debate going on amongst the Jews, before Jesus even shows up, about the afterlife. There was a lot of debate if there's an afterlife. There was one group called the Sadducees that actually believed there was no such thing as an afterlife. This is it. When you die, you're worm food, so you live it up because this is all you got. There was another group called the Pharisees, and what they believed is that there was a time in the future when God would resurrect the righteous dead and give them new bodies. They called it the resurrection, but it was a future event that was far out there in the future. When Jesus shows up, he actually disagrees with both camps. He says not only that there is a resurrection, but it's not an event in the future, it's a person. And that person is Jesus. He doesn't say that there is a resurrection. He doesn't even say, I'm going to be resurrected at some point. He says, I am the resurrection. Now, in a little bit, we'll get to the implications of what that means. But basically, when Jesus shows up, he takes things that are dead and brings them back to life. What we kill, what we hurt, what we mess up in this life, whether it's a relationship or a heart or whatever it is, Jesus has the ability to bring things back to life. But to fully understand the power of this, we got to see this in the context of the story that happens. Because not only is the story really powerful, but the people that are there, I think what's most interesting are the characters that are there that hear Jesus say this. So we're going to read the context of the story. We're going to highlight 3 of the people that are there. So when we understand that, there's a good chance that we're going to associate ourselves with one of the people who are there, because they're not that different from us. So in John chapter 11, starting at verse 1, it says, a man named Lazarus was sick. He lived in Bethany with his sisters, Mary and Martha. This is the Mary who later poured the expensive perfume on the Lord's feet and wiped them with her hair. Her brother, Lazarus, was sick. So the 2 sisters sent a message to Jesus telling him, Lord, your dear friend is very sick. So there's this guy by the name of Lazarus, and Lazarus is sick, and it's not that he has a head cold or athlete's foot. I mean, he's sick, and he's going to die. And his sisters, they send a message to Jesus. They know where Jesus is, They send a message to Jesus asking Jesus to come right away. Now, it does highlight this, that Jesus had a close relationship with these three. We forget that before Jesus kind of went public and started doing public ministry, he lived for about 30 years and developed relationships and had friends. Lazarus was counted as one of his good friends. And Lazarus was sick. And the reality is, when bad things happen to us, there's a couple of responses that we might have with God, right? At some point, bad things happen in our life. We can make the assumption that God doesn't care about us, right? That he knows what we're going through, he just doesn't care about it. Well, we can make the assumption that God can't do anything about it, right? That he sees it and he does care, but he's not powerful enough to do anything about it, and therefore we're just kind of on our own, right? If I don't look out for myself, then no one's going to look out for me, right? The other assumption we can make is this, is that even though bad things are happening right now, God is still up to something in it. And this is what Jesus is about to explain to them, that there is bad things happening to my good friend Lazarus, but nonetheless, God is up to something in it. And the reality is this, let me just pause for a second because this is really important, is that when bad things happen, the bad things that are going on right now in our lives, the reality is we have to make a choice of how we're going to respond to it. You know, do we assume that God doesn't care about us? Do we assume that God is absent or not involved in our lives? Or can we trust him and say, God, I don't see it yet, but I'm going to believe that you're up to something good, even in the trouble that I have right now. Now, Jesus does something that you wouldn't expect Jesus to do. He finds out that his friend Lazarus is sick, and they're asking him to go, and he doesn't go right away. Matter of fact, he waits a couple days before he goes. And it's not because he had to go to work or anything like that. He just doesn't go right away. Now, on the outside, someone might say it's because he's apathetic or doesn't. You might even say Jesus is just lazy because it's not even that far away, right? He had to walk, but he doesn't go right away. And what I'm saying is that even in the delay, God was up to something in that. Let's look at some more verses. The first person I want to highlight is one of the disciples named Thomas, who was dead in doubt. In John chapter 11, verse 18 says this, "But his disciples objected. Rabbi, they said, only a few days ago the people in Judea were trying to stone you. Are you going there again?" Jesus replied, "There are 12 hours of daylight every day. During the day people can walk safely. They can see because they see the light of the world. But in the night there is danger of stumbling because they have no light." Then he said, "Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but now I will go and wake him up." The disciples said, "Lord, if he is sleeping, he's going to get better." They thought Jesus meant Lazarus was simply sleeping, but Jesus meant that Lazarus had died. So he told him plainly, "Lazarus is dead, and for your sake, I'm glad. If I wasn't there, for now you will really believe. Come, let's go see him." And Thomas, nicknamed the twin, said to the disciples, "Let's go too and die with Jesus." A little light of sunshine from Thomas there, right? And when we think of Thomas, what we think of doubting Thomas, right? He's the disciple that after Jesus was resurrected, he said, "You know what? I'm not going to believe until I see him and touch the wounds on his hands and in his feet." So that's how we tend to think of Thomas. But Thomas had a history of kind of doubting, right? He had a history of not totally buying into what Jesus was saying. So Jesus is saying this. He's going to go down to this place where not long ago they were trying to kill him. And the disciples are trying to talk him out of it. And finally they decide to go, and Thomas is, I kind of hear him sarcastically saying, "Yeah, let's go too and die with Jesus," right? In other words, Jesus is leading us to our death. Jesus is not leading us the right way. If we follow Jesus, bad things are going to happen. God himself must have forgotten us. Now here's the reality. Thomas was a Christ follower, but he had doubts. There are Christ followers that I am guessing are in this room that sometimes struggle with doubt. And it can come in all kinds of different ways. Sometimes it's, God, are you really there? Sometimes it's, God, do you really care about me? I know you care about like the world in general, but me personally, do you really care about me personally? Sometimes we might doubt and say, Jesus, I know that you died on the cross, but do I even matter to you? Do I make a difference? Does my life count for anything? And I love it that Jesus doesn't give up on Christ followers that doubt. Do you know how you know this? Because Thomas said, I'm not going to believe until I touch his hands and his feet. And when Jesus showed up, you know what he did? He said, Thomas, touch my hands and my feet, right? You know, he knows where we're at, and he meets us where we're at. Here's the good news, is that Thomas was dead in doubt, but Jesus is the resurrection. It's not, the resurrection isn't an event, it's a person. If you're here today and maybe you're dead in doubt, the good news is this, is that Jesus can bring our faith back to life. Another person that is in this story is Mary, the sister of Lazarus, who was, I'll say it like this, dead in discouragement. Lazarus had two sisters, Mary and Martha, and we know them from different stories. One of the famous stories when Jesus goes to their house, and Martha is cooking dinner for Jesus, and Mary is just kind of hanging out with Jesus and listening to him. And Martha gets a little upset. Remember this? It says, Jesus, tell her to come help me. And Jesus says, actually, Mary is the one that has it right. But it shows how close Jesus was to this family. In John chapter 11, verse 17, it says this. It says, when Jesus arrived at Bethany, he was told that Lazarus had already been in the grave for 4 days. Now let me stop there for a second, because the 4 days is actually a little bit significant. In this culture, they had this kind of folklore idea that when someone died, the soul of the person hung around for 3 days. It's not a biblical idea. It's just kind of this urban legend kind of thing that grew at the time. So they believed that when someone died, the soul would just kind of hang around for 3 days, just in case that it had an opportunity to get back in the body somehow. But on the 4th day, the soul would depart. When Jesus arrives, Lazarus had been dead for 4 days. In other words, he wasn't kind of dead. He's all the way dead, right? He's dead and the soul is gone. Which leads me kind of to believe that's kind of why Jesus waited before he went there, right? Because if he showed up on the 2nd day and Lazarus came back to life, they would think it's just, the soul waiting around. But if the soul is departed and Lazarus comes back to life, the only conclusion that you can have is that Jesus has power over the grave. That's literally the only explanation for it. So in a way, that's kind of why I think he waits a couple of days. But then it says, Bethany was only a few miles down the road from Jerusalem, and many of the people had come to console Martha and Mary in their loss. When Martha got word that Jesus was coming, she went to meet him, but Mary stayed in the house. All right, so she hears that Jesus is coming, like he's on his way, but she doesn't move. Why? I think she was so discouraged that she gave up on even trying, right? Why bother? Nothing's going to happen. Now, the reality is that Christ followers can get into a place where we're dead in discouragement, where even if we believe that there is a good God out there, that Jesus died on the cross for us, we could be so dead in discouragement that we say, you know what, why bother? Right? My marriage is hanging on by a thread. It's never going to get better. Why bother? My job is not going anywhere. I'm never going to be able to find another job. It's just horrible. Why try? Why? My kids are always either in trouble or they are the trouble, right? It's not getting any better. Why bother with that? I'm always going to be alone. Why even bother? Right? Sometimes we could be so dead in our discouragement that we don't move anymore. The reality is, and here's the thing, Jesus shows up to the scene, and Mary is weeping, and there's other people there weeping with her. And the thing that I think is most important in this story is that Jesus sees what's going on and actually moves him to compassion, right? Jesus weeps alongside them. Now, crying at a funeral isn't like a strange thing, but the strange thing is this, is that Jesus knows what he's about to do. Remember, it's not that it's not that the resurrection is an event, it's a person, and he's that person. He knows that in a little bit, Lazarus is going to come back to life, but he feels the pain of the people around him, right? If sometimes we think that we're so distant from God that we feel pain, we feel lonely, we feel hurt, and we don't think God can relate to us, my guess is that Jesus weeps with us. That what we feel, he feels. And the primary motivation for dying on the cross for us is not because he doesn't care for us, it's that he loves us that much that he would die on the cross for us. The reality is that I know that sometimes we can be dead in our discouragement. That we can be discouraged for so long that we just give up. But the reality is, just like Mary who is dead in discouragement, Jesus is the resurrection. In that we might be our heart might have given up, but Jesus can bring things back to life. Amen. The third character in the story is the other sister, Martha, who is, I would say this, dead in God's delay. Dead in God's delay. In John chapter 11, verse 21, it says, Martha said to Jesus, Lord, if you had only been here, my brother would not have died. Now hear those words for a second, right? You can almost feel her pain. Jesus, you let me down. Do you hear that? If you would have just showed up, this would not have happened. But even now, I know that God will give you whatever you ask. Jesus told her, your brother will rise again. Yes, Martha said, he will rise when everyone else rises at the last day. Now, remember I said the Pharisees taught that there was a resurrection sometime in the future. That's what she's saying. She was under their teaching at some point. So she believed that in the distant future there would be a resurrection. Jesus changes her mind on this. It says, Jesus told her, I'm the resurrection and the life. Anyone who believes in me will live even after dying. Everyone who lives in me and believes in me will never ever die. And here's the important thing. Do you believe this, Martha? Because remember, it's not enough just to know about it, right? It's not enough just to have the information. It's not even enough to be sitting next to a person who believes in it, right? The question is, what do we do with it, right? Can we believe this? Can we believe it enough to build our life on it, to respond to it in the correct way? And Martha says this, yes, Lord, I have always believed you are the Messiah, the Son of God, the one who has come into the world from God. And notice where in verse 22 she says, but even now, Lord, if you would have been here, this wouldn't have happened, but even now, you can do something. I think some of us need a but even now moment, right? Maybe we've been waiting for God to do something in a relationship that's really important to us. And it doesn't seem like anything's happening, and we keep praying for it. We keep looking to God. Some of us need, and maybe we've given up on it. Some of us need a but even now moment. And to realize that even now, if Jesus shows up, that relationship can come back to life. Maybe you feel like your heart has been trampled on for a really long time. Maybe by people, maybe just by life, and it doesn't seem like it's ever going to get better. Maybe you've given up on joy in life, right? But even now, if God shows up, he can do something. Some of us need a but even now moment so we can redepend on God and see what he can do in our life. Jesus goes to the grave. I'm not going to read this part, but he goes to the grave, and Jesus calls out to Lazarus. He says, Lazarus, come out. Jesus tells Lazarus to come out, and Lazarus comes back to life. What I want to point out from that is this, is that Jesus isn't shouting out wishful thinking, right? Lazarus, I hope you're okay in that grave, right? He commands a dead person to come back to life. Jesus tells a dead person to live again, and he lives again. Now, I tell you this to compare to what is your biggest struggle right now? What's your biggest trial? It could be a job, relationship. It could be heart. It could be a faith issue. It could be discouragement. It could be, God, what do you want me to do next? Here's the thing. Jesus called out to a dead person, and that person came back to life. Chances are our biggest struggle is actually easier for Jesus to handle than that thing, right? If Jesus conquers the grave, he can heal our heart. If Jesus conquered life and death, the reality is your relationship can be restored, right? If Jesus brought Lazarus back from the dead, he can breathe life back into your heart again, right? Understand, here's the point. It's Jesus, right? It's not an event. The resurrection is an event that happens in the future. It's a person that's available right now, right? And here's the, at the Journey Church, we say you don't need a religion. You don't need a list of rules, of do's and don'ts. What you need is a relationship with Jesus, right? Because there's not a list of rules that can bring you back to life. It doesn't exist. There's not a list of a religion that you can follow that can breathe life back into a relationship. But Jesus changes the heart. He changes our mind. He can change our life. Right? What we killed, Jesus can bring back to life. Let's pray together.